Hi everyone, my name is Nadia Nafi and I am a PhD candidate at Concordia University in Montreal, Canada. In this video, I share the presentation I made during the 13th European Personal Construct Association Conference in Italy. This presentation gives you a glimpse of the work I'm doing for my doctoral project under the supervision of Dr. Anne-Louise Davidson. I first explain how Josh Kelly's personal construct psychology could be applied to the context of the Syrian refugee settlement, using the Canadian context as example. Then I present the tools and techniques that I'm using to conduct an inquiry about how youth from host societies construe online interactions regarding the Syrian refugee crisis. Since I'm still in my data collection phase and I did not complete any analysis yet of my data, the results that I will be sharing with you are really very preliminary, just to give you an idea about what I heard from the participants in my research project. In the beginning of November 2015, Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau promised to welcome 25,000 Syrian refugees by the end of the year and to invest $250 million to do so. By sea or by air, the Liberals pledged to do whatever it took to get the refugees to Canada, despite the challenges that Canada and the refugees could face. On November 13th, 2015, Paris terror attacks happened. Le Petit Cambodge, Stade de France, Le Carillon, Café Bonne-Pierre, La Belle Équipe, Comptoir Voltaire, and the Bataclan Theatre were attacked. Hundreds were injured, and 130 were killed. Pictures and videos of the attacks were immediately shared online, along with feelings of anger, of fear, of worry. And the fear and anxiousness that were lived in Europe were experienced vigorously in Canada. Many Canadians were terrified, and yet the Prime Minister held firm to his commitment to bring 25,000 refugees to Canada in a very short period of time. People reacted with what the media dubbed the Battle of Petitions. Thousands of people signed petitions supporting the arrival of these refugees, while also thousands of people signed petitions urging the Prime Minister to reconsider his decision. While more people signed the against petitions, in both camps, people not only signed, but they also added comments in which they argued their positions. What was happening online was not limited to signing petitions. People were sharing what they thought would bring to light what was happening offline. In Toronto, people were asking Muslims if they were sorry for the slaughter of innocent people in Paris. A girl was attacked on her way to a subway station for wearing a scarf in a typical cold day in Canada. The man grabbed her by her jacket and yelled at her to remove her hijab. She shared on Facebook what happened to her and she said, "Note, I'm not a Muslim, nor a refugee, but today I saw how it felt to be unsafe where you are trying to find safety. Please share and share and share." In Montreal, a video of a man in a Joker mask promising to kill a Muslim per day went viral. The police arrested him, but not before he succeeded in spreading fear among Muslims and non-Muslims in Quebec. Despite all the negativity, positive posts were also shared online. For instance, pictures and videos of the three young men, Matt, Amar, and Thomas from Montreal, who spent a day in a subway station holding hands and confirming that Muslims and non-Muslims were united, were distributed by online media and were shared thousands of times in thousands of online networks. Then, on New Year's Eve, Cologne sexual assaults happened. The world was shaken following reports that as many as 1,000 women were sexually assaulted at Cologne's central train station. Again, videos, testimonials, and pictures went viral and were followed by posts accusing Muslim refugees and Muslim immigrants of being rapists. Rape, rape, rape. You can do it in Finland. Refugees can do anything. You will not be punished. The hashtag refugees was trending on Facebook and on Twitter. And what was happening online was transferred offline. Syrian refugees were attacked. For instance, in Vancouver, Syrian refugees were pepper sprayed during a welcome night event. Trudeau had to go online to assure everyone that what happened does not represent Canada and does not reflect the warm, welcome Canadians have offered. On the 22nd of March 2016, Brussels terror attacks happened, and the same online reactions followed. Our online youth, who had access to all of these online posts and interactions, are part of the system. When we talk about the integration and the inclusion of the refugees, we cannot ignore the youth who will be on the front line during the whole process. And when we talk about online youth, we talk about Syrian refugee youth who are fleeing the war zone and hoping to reach the safe land. The host society youth who are the one welcoming these newcomers to their homes, to their schools, to their lives. And the immigrant youth who are still in the transitional period. They are trying to construct their identity while being torn between cultures and positions. Within online youth, we also have youth who are for the settlement of Syrian refugees, youth who are against the settlement of Syrian refugees, and undecided or neutral youth who still do not know which position to take or which camp to belong to. Research on media and youth would claim that our youth are bombarded by all these online posts, that social media is affecting them, controlling them, manipulating them, and forcing them into one of these camps. But Kelly would argue that our youth actually have the choice. A person's processes are psychologically channelized by the ways in which he anticipates events. Through this fundamental postulate, Kelly assumes that our processes, thoughts, feelings, and behaviors operate in a structured manner and are determined by our predictions of the future. Youth choose how to interpret these online interactions using their construct systems. Then, based on their interpretations, they predict future events in regards to the Syrian refugees' arrival. And then, according to these predictions, they choose how to behave once they are in the same environment as these newcomers. So, our youth use their behavior to test their predictions and to validate them. So again, according to Kelly, our youth have the choice. As an example of what I'm talking about, I would like to share with you the following. This is one of the comments that I retrieved from one of the petitions that were launched to stop refugees entering Canada. Islam is a primitive, violent religion practiced by the scum of the earth. Europe is being invaded by force, and we bring them over, house and feed them willingly. The cowards should go back and fight for their own country. So, if a host society youth interprets this comment as Syrian refugees are violent, he or she will predict that these newcomers will invade our countries. So naturally, the host society youth will do everything and anything in his power or her power to stop the arrival of these refugees or to exclude them if they ever enter. Now, if we consider the construct violent victim and the youth chooses the victim pole instead of the violent pole while interpreting the comment, he or she will consider the Syrian refugees as victims and predict that they will be devastated when reading such comments. His or her behavior would probably be welcoming to the newcomers, and he or she would do his or her best to make sure that the newcomers feel home and safe. Through my doctoral project, I'm hoping to answer the following research questions. What construct systems do youth from host societies use when they encounter online interactions about the resettlement of Syrian refugees? Using their construct systems, how do youth from host societies predict events regarding Syrian refugees? And using their predictions, how do youth from host societies react to the Syrian refugee crisis? Now, why am I focusing on host society youth instead of Syrian refugee youth? Many efforts are invested in helping the refugees integrate. However, once they arrive in their host societies, they will be received by youth who will be expected to include them. If the host society youth are not ready to welcome these newcomers, if the ground is not ready to accept these newcomers, all the efforts will go in vain. Integration cannot happen without inclusion. While both concepts might appear to be the same at first glance, they are significantly different. Integration occurs when newcomers adjust, and inclusion occurs when the whole society adjusts. The settlement of Syrian refugee youth will occur when both groups engage in change and in acceptance. While most focus on the refugees' integration, my objective is to focus on the whole society youth's readiness level to include these refugees, especially after going through all these different online interactions regarding the crisis. I recruited 42 participants from Canada, Europe, and the Middle East. The participants are between 16 and 24 years old, and they are all active on social media. I'm planning to conduct 3 interviews per participant in either French, English, or Arabic, dependently on the participant's preference. The 126 interviews are confidential and anonymous, and I already completed 46 of them. In the following slides, I will share with you the tools and techniques I'm using to conduct these interviews. Since I'm based in Montreal, Quebec, I meet distant participants through Skype. I use Google Drive for the activities we do, and I record everything with Camtasia. The techniques I use are adapted from Kelly's self-characterization technique, Proctor's Perceiver element grid, Kelly's repertory grid, and Hinkle's laddering technique. In the first interview, I start by asking participants general demographic questions. Then we move to the self-characterization technique and the perceiver grid. In the second interview, the participants complete a repertory grid. And in the third interview, we start by laddering few constructs, and then I ask the participants some validation questions based on the previous interviews. I usually plan for 1 hour per interview. However, the participants whom I already interviewed were so engaged that sometimes the interviews went up to 2 hours. So let's start with Kelly's self-characterization technique. The self-characterization technique is an application of the credulous approach adopted by Kelly in the personal construct psychology. It falls under the sociality corollary, which states, to the extent that one person construes the construction processes of another, he may play a role in a social process involving the other person. The self-characterization technique allows the researcher to relate to the participant through discovering how the participant channels his or her constructs. The researcher asks the participants to write a character sketch in the third person as if their best friend is writing it. And the request is, I want you to write a character sketch of, let's say, Eli, just as if he were the principal character in a play. Write it as it might be written by a friend who knew him very intimately and very sympathetically, perhaps better than anyone ever really could know him. Make sure to write it in the third person. For example, start out by saying, Eli is. Kelly explains that the phrasing of this request has gone through a great number of revisions, and that every term was chosen carefully and purposefully. So the term character sketch frees the participants from following specific structures and allows them to describe themselves through their own construct system. Using the third person distances the participants from having the impression that they are writing a confession and encourages them to do the efforts to conceptualize themselves from an external perspective. Kelly uses the term intimately to communicate that an in-depth portrayal is expected, and the term sympathetically to emphasize the importance that the participants accept themselves as they are and disregard what they are not or what they think they ought to be. The term friend is employed to give the participants the feeling that they are in a safe environment. The phrase, perhaps better than anyone ever really could know him or her, would discourage participants from recalling a specific individual from their circle and writing the sketch based on what they perceive would be their objective version. Kelly intentionally omits any suggestion of an outline to preserve the participants' spontaneity and to respect their own outline. This aims to help the researcher to see how the participants structures their word, identify their role in this word, and place themselves on the spectrum of the constructs they use. In order for me to better answer my research questions, I made two additions to Kelly's text. First, I added the context of the online interactions in regards to the Syrian refugee crisis. Second, I asked the participants to write the comment that they would share online if they were to react to these online interactions. Later on, you will see how I used this comment. I added it to the second interview and I used it as an element while completing the repertory grid. I text the instructions to the participants, or I add the instructions to a Google Doc and send the link to the participants, who usually take between 5 to 10 minutes to write their character sketch. As I mentioned previously, I did not start analyzing my data yet. However, it would be super interesting to look at the layout and the structure of these three texts from three different participants and notice how different they are. The first text is well divided into three separate sections where the participant introduces herself, then explains what she would do if she encounters online interactions about the Syrian refugees, and then in the third section she discusses the comment that she would share. The second participant shares a very concise paragraph, yet he also succeeds in respecting the requirements of this activity. The third participant engages in storytelling. So after he states the first sentence, he continues with, "One day, I saw him in front of his computer. What I saw was bone-chilling. Instead of usual marathons with adult movies or another amazing video game, his mind was focused on, oh my God, a news website. That was odd. I approached him, thought he smoked a cigarette, I hate smokers, and asked him, 'Dude, what the heck?' He replied, 'Yeah, good to see you too,' and immersed back in the interwebs." Kelly's first concern was to make sure that participants had the liberty to structure their own representation, and this objective was clearly met in these examples. The second technique I used in the first interview was adapted from one of Proctor's qualitative grids, the Perceiver Element Grid, or the PEG. This technique also originates from Kelly's sociality corollary, which states that in order to relate to people, it is essential that one understands how they construe the word, even if this understanding is still a work in progress. The Perceiver Element Grid examines how individuals perceive themselves and others. Namely, it investigates how individuals see themselves, how they see others, how they think others see them, and how they think others see themselves. In my adaptation of the PEG, I started by selecting posts shared on Facebook after the three attacks I mentioned earlier, so Paris terrorist attack, Cologne sexual assaults, and Brussels terrorist attacks. I shared these posts with participants and I asked them to stop at whichever post they would stop on if they were online. And then I asked them, why did you stop on these posts? After listening to their answers, I asked them the following questions. For the purpose of this presentation, let's say that we are interviewing a Canadian youth. So the host country will be Canada. And the questions will be, how do you construe or interpret the content of these posts? How do you think members of online Canadian youth construe or interpret the content of these posts? How do you think Syrian refugees construe or interpret the content of these posts? How do you think members of the online Canadian youth or your online network think that you construe or interpret the content of these posts? How do you think members of the online Canadian youth or your online network think their own group construe or interpret the content of these posts? How do you think members of the online Canadian youth or your online network think Syrian refugees construe or interpret the content of these posts? How do you think Syrian refugees think that you construe or interpret the content of these posts? How do you think Syrian refugees think members of the online Canadian youth construe or interpret the content of these posts? And how do you think Syrian refugees think their own group construe or interpret the content of these posts? Participants who I already interviewed were surprised by these questions, since many of them never put themselves in the shoes of others when reading these posts. Some of them even asked me for more time to think about their answers. So I noticed that participants were actually intrigued by the questions and how they would answer them. So I decided to challenge them even further and ask them about the relationship between what's happening online and what's happening offline. So the questions that I added to the bag were: how would you behave if you happened to meet a Syrian refugee for the first time ever in your classroom after you have read these posts and comments? How do you think members of the online Canadian youth who have never encountered a Syrian refugee before but have read all these posts and comments would behave when they first meet a Syrian refugee in their classrooms? And how do you think Syrian refugees who never encountered a Canadian youth before, but they have read all these posts and comments, would behave when they first meet a Canadian youth in their classroom? As you can notice, I intentionally put the participants in an if-then situation, and I insist on the fact that no contact whatsoever has taken place, because as soon as a contact occurs, validation happens, right? So once validation happens, participants will know whether their predictions were correct or whether they need to modify them. In the second interview, the participants complete a repertory grid. The repertory grid test is a diagnostic and research tool that captures a snapshot of the representation of a person's construct system and makes the tacit explicit. The qualitative and quantitative data that it generates emerges completely from the participant's mental map, uncontaminated by the researcher's construct system, and makes of this technique one of the first mixed methods approaches in psychology. The repertory grid test requires 3 steps. The first step is to specify the elements. And the elements could be concrete situations, problems, events, people, etc. To answer my research questions, I used comments shared in the petitions supporting or arguing against the settlement of Syrian refugees in Canada as elements. In order to limit my bias as much as possible, in the selection of the comments, I used the inclusion and exclusion factors which were identified in the literature as selection criteria in the first selection round. These factors were expectations, perception of real or symbolic threat, dominance of a reductive vision, old guards, need to maintain privilege, lack of trust, us, them, or ours, theirs constructs, dominative racism, aversive racism, color-blind racism and racialized habitus, worthy, unworthy, and indispensable, unneeded constructs, ignorance of others' culture, and communication noise. In the second selection round, I used constructs elicited by participants in pilot testing as selection criteria. The constructs were us, them, ours, theirs, high risk, life-threatening, trust or safe, identity and culture at risk, multiculturalism, ignorance of others' culture, aware of others' situation, not our responsibility, humanity, empathy, fair, unfair, worthy, unworthy, indispensable, unneeded, right, wrong, what happened there will happen here, there and here are different, Canadians first, Canadian nature, negative stereotype, refugees as terrorists, refugees as victims, newcomers can't, won't, and are not ready to integrate, newcomers will integrate, dominative racism, tolerance, old guards, accommodation. I started with over 280 comments and narrowed them down to 34. During the interviews, I asked participants to select 8 of the 34 comments as elements to work with. The 8 should be the ones that they would actually read when they are online. Examples of these comments are: they would have nightmares one day after landing in Canada and reading Canadian newspaper comments. If Canada is accepting all these Muslim refugees, then they should only be allowed if they are prepared to accept Canadian values, our way of life, live under our law, dress as Canadians, and accept gender equality. I'm not against helping the unfortunate. These Muslims are like the plague. Treat them as such. Canada is so naive. It saddens me that so many Canadians are reading stories from unreliable sources and taking others' hatred verbatim. Syrian refugees are running from the same things we are scared of. They are not the problem. When conducting the interview offline, the participants select from comments printed on cardboards. When we are online, the participants copy-paste the comments they select in a table in Google Doc. The second step is to elicit the constructs through the triadic elicitation technique. I randomly select 3 elements and ask the participants, in what important way are 2 of them alike but different from the third? And of course, I ask the participants to explain their choices. This process is repeated until all groupings are explored or until the participant reaches a full saturation of constructs. While the first repetitions are done randomly, when I notice that the participants are reaching saturation, I ask them to purposefully choose the 3 elements based on constructs they did not discuss before. When meeting offline, the participants use the printed comments and write the constructs on cardboards. When you are online, the participants copy-paste the 3 comments in the table as shown on the slide, then highlight the grouped elements before adding the 2 ends of the construct under similarity and as opposed to. The third step is to rate the elements to the constructs to identify the elements' constructs interaction. In this completed matrix of numbers, we can identify how a participant thinks through his or her constructs, and what a participant thinks through the ratings of the elements on the construct's binary scale. At this stage, I ask participants to select only 3 elements or comments to rate. The elements and constructs are entered in the repertory grid or matrix and are presented on a semantic differentiation scale from 1 to 5. I ask the participant to give a score to each of the elements in order to identify at which end or which pole of the construct the element is the nearest to. And I always encourage the participants to explain their choice of rating. When the 3 elements are rated, I add participants' own comment to the matrix. This comment was written by the participant during the first interview in the self-characterization technique. Now, moving to our third interview. Through Henkel's laddering technique, the participants elaborate on an existing construct to reach more general variants or superordinate constructs. So, in the third interview, I asked participants to choose one construct from the ones they elicited in the second interview, and then we performed the laddering technique 3 times. The first time I asked the participants the following question: Which side of the construct I mention is clearly descriptive of the kind of comments you prefer to share about the Syrian refugee crisis? So let's take one of the examples here. The construct is burden asset. The participant chose asset. And then I asked the participant, why? And he said, because considering the refugees as asset would encourage them to contribute. Then I asked him, as opposed to? And he answered, as opposed to only using our resources. Then I asked the same question for the construct use resources contribute. The participant chose contribute, and I asked why, and he answered, well, when the refugees contribute, they will have a better life, as opposed to stealing. And we continued the process until we reached the superordinate construct, no progress, progress. And the second time, I asked the participant the following question for the same construct. Which side of the construct I mention is clearly descriptive of the kind of comment you guess host society youth from the against camp prefer to share about the Syrian refugee crisis? And in the third, I ask, which side of the construct dimension is clearly descriptive of the kind of comment you guess host society youth from the for camp prefer to share about the Syrian refugee crisis? Putting themselves in the shoes of other people is very challenging to participants, especially when the others are not in their camp or do not share their position in regards to the Syrian refugee crisis. As I previously mentioned, I'm still in the process of collecting my data, so no data analysis is done yet. The results I will be sharing with you now are really preliminary, just to give you an idea about some of what I have heard from the participants I have already interviewed. Many of the participants said that people who were against Syrian refugees entering their countries were more vocal online than people who supported it. Many of the participants rarely engaged in interactions about the Syrian refugees crisis. And almost all of them said that negative posts stick. They said that despite the fact that we had positive posts, the ones that were remembered were the negative ones. And most of them felt that Syrian refugees were dehumanized in social media, that they were no longer treated as people, and that they were considered as problems to deal with. Some examples of elicited constructs: uneducated, based on experience; religion equals problem; historical events predict future; aggressive tone, accepting tone; refugees equals terrorists, fear of change; negative attributions to Muslims, Muslims equal human; no coexistence between Islam and Canada, clash in nationality; valid concerns, trend; misconception, scapegoating; opposed to ideology, opposed to change; concerned with well-being of people, concerned with self-well-being; Islamophobic, politically opposed; argumentative, hate speech; globally focused, and locally focused. As for participants' predictions, they said that after reading these posts, many participants felt responsible to compensate offline for the negative posts that were shared online. Participants also predicted that host society youth who have read online posts and have never encountered Syrian refugees before would keep their distance when they first meet any in their classrooms. They would be scared to approach them. Participants also predicted that Syrian refugee youth who have read online posts and have never encountered host society youth before would also keep their distance, since they are not sure who welcomes them and who hates them and wants them to stay in the war zone.